So, welcome back to Thrones of Britannia and to an online battle replay, and I've been dabbling in some of the multiplayer aspects of Thrones of Britannia, although mainly I have been focusing on campaign. There are a few intricacies to the Thrones of Britannia meta which have already popped up, one of which, and one of the most obvious, is that Berserkers are incredibly strong on the front line. Most of the games you'll see online will put some sort of cap on Berserkers, because if you have a front line made of them, there's really very little that the factions that don't have Berserkers can do about that. So I would imagine that that's going to be something which continues. Also, the siege battles, there are a few things, a few holdovers from Attila. Obviously the games are very similar. You know, there are a few mechanical differences, of course, but for the most part, Thrones of Britannia is extremely reminiscent of Attila in terms of how it plays, with cavalry really being the main difference. But this here is Hadrian's wall, and as you can see, there's the wall here which has crumbled in several places. Not exactly fully faithful to the real Hadrian's wall, but nonetheless the historic border between England and Scotland. But in this case, England and Scotland stand united. I'm going to be playing as Wessex, and my ally is going to be playing as Kirkin. And then we've got two Norman armies. So really, if the Normans had already managed to conquer England all the way up to Hadrian's wall, there's not much of England left for them to conquer, to be honest with you. This is where the Romans stopped, so let's see how the Normans get on. And let's go through the Norman army first of all, because you know the Normans, obviously you can't actually play as them in campaign. They are the late game crisis, and the late game crisis is certainly not as scary as chaos. It's honestly quite easy to quickly deal with it, but still. We have, I think, 3 or 4 units of Norman horsemen over here, which is a pretty large investment of cavalry. Obviously, cavalry is quite fickle in this game. If you misuse it, it can fall apart very, very quickly. Usefulness of wedge is also there, but you have to make sure to cycle charge very quickly, otherwise your cavalry's melee skill will suffer for it. And this is just a tier 1 retinue melee cavalry, so not the strongest cavalry that the Normans can field, but they are still going to be pretty difficult to take down one-to-one for a lot of other factions in terms of their cavalry offerings. You know, obviously their cavalry is one of the things which the Normans will certainly hold over a lot of the other factions in online play. It's really only the Welsh kingdoms that can stand up to them in this respect. Meanwhile, let's go and have a look at what's going on with their front line. And at the front here you can see that we've got some Norman mailed spears, obviously with the classic Norman teardrop shields. And this is, you know, there is a bit of a uniformity going on with the Norman roster. And here you can see the front line spears all the way down, and armour values across the higher tier of Norman units are going to be very good, of course. That's going to be one of the things they focus on. They do lack a little bit in terms of their offensive units, or out-and-out axe units and such. But having said that, they are able to field a great number of these decent quality units here, which is probably what the Normans have over most of the British factions in general as well. And the Norman mailed spears, I think they run you 700 or 800 gold, which is not a huge amount when you compare it to some of the really expensive stuff, but it is still getting up there. Obviously tier 3 retinue spear infantry is going to be able to deal with a lot, and spears are going to be quite useful on the offense in Thrones of Britannia as well. At the front here we've got 4 units of Norman levy archers. They are the lowest tier of archers that the Normans can bring, and obviously, you know, archers are quite useful in this game, but not in the same way that they have been in the past. They won't be able to win you the battle all on their lonesome because of the influence of the shield values. You know, obviously, if you put your units into shield castle, they're going to be able to withstand volleys from an archer unit like this all day long. But they can be used to help really turn a cavalry fight in your favour, and just winning the early game skirmish can give you a numbers advantage, which can cause a cascading failure if you lose that skirmish fight. But again, only 4 units of the lowest archers, so they have skimped out a little bit on their archers here, at least this first army has. And I think this is the army played by Black Widow, and the other one is played by Hazinger. Over here we have the Norman Footsoldiers, and they are the sort of the most, I think they're the strongest Norman sword unit. They are going to, of course, be the basic infantry of the Normans, which you're going to see quite a lot of. They again run you about 800 gold, I think. Much more focused on their armour values. They do lack a little bit in terms of melee skill next to some of the really expensive stuff like the Yoms Vikings from the Norse invaders, or the Royal Thanes from the Anglo-Saxon factions. But having said that, you can still field these guys in great numbers, and as far as a uniform quality goes, they are going to be able to overpower a lot of other factions, because, you know, I think cost efficiency is the order of the day when it comes to the Norman army. They don't have as much variety in their roster as some of the others do, and I think this comes from the fact that, you know, a little bit less was put into them, because they are ultimately just a late game crisis faction as it stands at the moment, and you can't actually play as them. But having said that, the Norman Footsoldiers do still make for a very strong sword unit indeed. And I think that's all they have back here. So yeah, the Norman foot soldiers sort of just arranged behind the Norman mailed spearmen that are in Shield Castle. And then finally we have the Norman Huscarls, which is the general's bodyguard. So again, you can punt for a horsebound bodyguard, which is very expensive. I think it's the most expensive bodyguard unit in the game. But obviously it is obviously in a singular term the best cavalry unit as well. But here they've already got 4 cavalry units out on the flank, so he's decided to go for some Norman Huscarls, which are the exception when it comes to the Normans and their axe units, because they are of course very strong, showing their Norse heritage here in this axe unit. But it is not present anywhere else in their army, interestingly enough. Meanwhile, we shall now move over to the other army, which I think is commanded by Hasinger, and I would imagine it's going to be quite similar. So you can see again he's got a very thick front line here of Norman mailed spearmen. And this is unsurprising because the spears can be used to in an offensive capacity as well, and of course you really don't want to be charging cavalry into the front of these spears, and of course they do have a good shield value as well at 40. Melee skill of 38 is not bad for a spear unit either, and of course high morale, professional Norman army of course, which can contrast quite nicely with factions they're up against. And he's gone for Norman archers, basic Norman archers, you can tell, because they've ditched their peasant hats for an actual metal helmet. So he's invested a little bit more in his archers, so we'll see how well they can do against Kirkin, because this is the army which is facing off against the Bonnie Scots. And that is it, yeah, Norman archers. And again, back here, I can't imagine it's going to be too much different. So yeah, again, we've got some Norman foot soldiers back here, the sword infantry, which should be able to do quite nicely against a lot of the Kirkin units. More Norman foot soldiers, and again more Norman foot soldiers, so they are the best infantry unit that the Normans can bring. And this was a decent funds battle, but the Normans, again, if you can afford to bring them, you really do want them. And here we have the Norman Miles, which is the most expensive bodyguard unit in the game, I believe. The heavy cavalry, the elite melee cavalry that the Normans have. Combining these with the Norman knights as well in big numbers can leave the Norman cavalry force to be quite scary, but of course it is very micro heavy, because you can find your cavalry melting away very quickly in Thrones of Britannia. It's certainly not something you can use as a crutch. And over here he does have a unit of Norman knights, so he does have individually cavalry and archer units of greater quality, but his ally has brought a little bit more in terms of infantry, I think, a little bit more in terms of the Norman foot soldiers. Now though, we shall move on to the native British factions. Well, the Saxons aren't native, but you get what I mean. The ones who want to throw off the invaders, and we'll start off with my ally, who again I forget the name of, but we'll go through their names at the end of the fight. And we can see here he's got some Highland sharpshooters, some tier 3 levy bow infantry, and you can see they've got the Scottish plaid on there. And tier 3 levy bow infantry means they're going to be suitable to deal with all of the Norman archers that are arrayed before us. So, you know, again, nice to see that the ranged advantage is going to be ours in the early game over here. And over here we can see that he's already got some of his units in shield wall. We've got some Alban Axe Warriors, which are retinue axe infantry tier 2. I believe this is actually the strongest axe unit that Kirkin can field. You know, they do lack a little bit in terms of their axes next to Mead, the other Gaelic faction, who have got a little bit more Viking influence to them. But here we have the Scots using their Alban Axe Warriors, which should be able to do a decent job up against the Norman foot soldiers. They may not win 1-to-1, and they will struggle against the spears, I think, but nonetheless having a bit of bite in our front line here will certainly help matters out on this flank. Some more Alban Axe Warriors who are not in shield castles, so we can get a closer look at their uniforms, and they look very nice indeed. I like the blue and white colour scheme of the Scots, honestly. And over here we can also see that we've got some Skiltron, obviously the well-known formation from Medieval 2. Obviously, interestingly enough, Kirkin don't actually have like a super-powered spear unit, which you would think that the Scots would have that, considering what happened at Bannockburn, but I guess this is quite a time before that. Nonetheless, tier 3 levy spear infantry, very cost-effective, of course, and obviously these spears will be guarding the flank against that marauding Norman cavalry, which we're going to have to be very careful about. Over here in the middle, again, more Alban Axe Warriors, so he's gone for a lot of axes here, which should serve us quite well against the Norman foot soldiers. And I think that's just about it. Actually, we've got some King's Blades over here, which are a very strong, if we just get in to see their armour back here. I do like the look of the King's Blades as well, the Gaelic high-tier infantry units. The King's Blades are one of the finest elite sword infantry units in the game. They are tier 3 elite sword infantry, so they will actually outclass 1-to-1 the Norman foot soldiers, but they are also considerably more expensive, so the cost efficiency is going to be in question, especially if they get charged by cavalry in the rear, which we really need to avoid. And we've got some sword warriors over here as well, which are retinue sword infantry, so obviously not as good as the King's Blades, but still quite good. And over here we have some more Highland sharpshooters, so again we've got 4 units of archers over here from my ally. Back here I would assume this is going to be more Skiltron, indeed it is. And then out over here we have the General's Bodyguard, which is the Royal Bodyguard, so he's punted for a cavalry bodyguard unit as well. They will obviously lose 1-to-1 with the Norman Miles, but they should be able to hold their own in a cav fight against the Normans, provided they're not swamped. So if our archers stay on hand to help them out, we should be okay. And over here he's got another unit hidden in the forest over here, another unit of cavalry ready to come and aid, and Royal Cavalry. Is this the general? I don't actually know what the Kirkin generals are. He's got 2 units of Royal Bodyguard. That's Royal Cavalry. Well, regardless, he's got some tier 3 cavalry over there. He's got 3 units of very strong cavalry. We are outnumbered in terms of the cav fight overall in the battlefield, but we aren't surrendering quite so easily. And then finally we shall move on to my army. Over here I've got 4 units, 2 on each flank of the select militia spearmen, levy spear infantry, but they are the finest levy spears that I've got. Obviously, as Wessex, I don't have quite the same variety of spears as the other Saxon faction in Mercia have, but they've got decent armour values for a levy spear unit, and honestly all I need is to keep the cavalry off my flanks, and if need be I can also use them to crush in from the sides. Back here I've got 4 units of my own archers as well, and like my ally I've gone for levy bow infantry. The best unit that I can bring are the select feared archers, which aren't bad. They should be able to trade well with the archers that are on my flank, but they would trade evenly with the archers on the other flank, so we'll see how well that goes. And meanwhile on the front line over here I have 4 units, so I've invested an awful lot in my front line of infantry, because I have got 4 units of Royal Thanes, which overall should be able to just about beat the Norman foot soldiers 1-to-1, and they will do a very good job against the spears that are over here as well, or at least they should. And then in the middle of all of them I do have my general as well, fighting on the front line for Saxon honour over here, the Royal Bodyguard. So again, this is the higher tier of bodyguard that I can bring. They've got some teardrop shields as well, but they will of course be holding down the centre of my front line, which is very solid. And I didn't want my front line to collapse easily at all. So hopefully this means that the Norman infantry will just sort of grind up against my front line, and we'll be able to win that fight, and then we can start to pressure them from the flanks. I should be able to beat them on the front line as well. More select archers, more select spears. And then back here we do have some of my, well, the hammer as it were in my army. I've got 2 units of the Char Laxman, which honestly I had a bit of spare money, so I just decided to bring them for a bit of chaff. And as axemen they should at least do some damage to Norman foot soldiers if they get into melee, but ultimately if the line started to break anywhere I would just quickly move up these axemen and hopefully they would just be enough to hold the line down. But I have 2 units of these Royal Huscarls, which in terms of killing power, they will be relatively unmatched on the battlefield in terms of the infantry. The Norman Huscarls will be able to trade relatively evenly with them, but most of the foot soldiers and spearmen will struggle mightily to deal with the Royal Huscarls, so they are the pride and joy of my infantry line alongside the Royal Thanes. The combination of those 2 is what makes the Saxon infantry so scary. And then if we have a look over here, we can also see that I have 2 units of cavalry hidden in the trees, 2 units of the Earl's Horsemen. The mailed horsemen are better than these lads, but ultimately again I just wanted to make sure that I had some mobility so the cav couldn't slip through the cracks and get some hammer and anvil, because honestly, at least on my flank, if I can prevent them getting hammer and anvil on my front line, I imagine that I will do very well in the fight. I am outnumbered, but my troops are of my troops are of noticeably higher quality in terms of at the front, particularly with those Royal Huscarls. So without further ado, let us begin. And obviously my ally has also got some Highland sharpshooters in here as well, so he's actually brought 6 archer units, which does mean my ally has got a little bit of a deficiency in terms of infantry. Been trying to get a replay on Thrones of Britannia for a little while, but obviously finding a game and it being of suitable quality is always a little bit of a challenge. Sometimes fights end prematurely when someone rage quits, or it's just horribly one-sided. But again, I'm not really I haven't really gotten to grips fully with it yet in the same way that I have with Medieval 2 and 3rd Age Reforged, of course, but for the most part, there is always going to be a fairly elongated skirmish at the start, although thankfully in this battle it isn't quite so long. My ally was the only one to really saturate his army with archers, so that means, of course, that there will eventually be an infantry fight. But the early game skirmish really only influences how it works later on. Formations and forming up your army properly is very important because, of course, with the shields, with Shield Castle and those formations, you can give yourself a very big advantage going into the late game. The enemy reveals themselves. The Normans here. Of course, William the Conqueror came significantly later than the time period in which Thrones of Britannia is actually set, but I do appreciate the fact they added a late game a late game crisis nonetheless. I just wish it was a little bit more potent. Hopefully on the Steam Workshop they can make the Normans and the Norse invasion in the late game a little bit more scary. Because I have achieved the ultimate victory condition in a campaign already, and I have to say it was relatively easy to defeat the Norse invasion in the north, and the Normans in the south honestly didn't get too far against the AI-controlled England.
The enemy's attacking our ally!
So the enemy is attacking our ally, so the skirmish fight is beginning. And the basic Norman archers are, I think, firing. Indeed they are. Just these basic archers. Very interesting orange colour scheme. Going up against the blue of Kirkin. England and Scotland, not natural allies throughout our history, of course, but nonetheless we fight together here to throw off the invaders from the continent. Oh, here go the archers from the other player over here. I think this is Black Widow's army. A gracious host he was. And he is moving up here. His archers are in a bit of a blob over here. And honestly, my archers are of higher quality. The best way to deal with this, though, would be to try and focus down individual units at a time. But the very low armor values on these archers. In fact, yeah, their armor values are 7, which is basically nothing. In melee, they're obviously terrible. And the skirmish fight, you know, it's a very touchy-feely game, this one. You know, you have to be, if you're going to commit, you have to be sure, because there's going to be no retreat. Once you're in for the duration. Otherwise your army will fall apart. I'm bringing over more of my select archers over here. He's getting his archers into a bit of a wider formation to prevent the blobbing and the extreme kills over here. You can see that the arrow fire going backwards and forwards. Let's go and have a look at my archers as well. Some of the select archers over here with chain shirts, mailed. Again, just a continuous skirmish back and forth. I have actually managed to break one of his archer units already by focusing them down. And I was hoping to go up and around the line, but I think my opponent realised that he didn't really stand a chance in this skirmish fight. He did some decent damage to one of my units. I think it was this one over here. Eventually, anyway, when yeah, 46 out of 60. You can see these cavalry units over here in wedge, so I pulled over these Earl's Horsemen over here to ensure Hadrian's Wall is actually helping me here by forming a natural barrier to make sure they can't get too close. It would take them significantly longer to cycle around, which will certainly help me in the long run. The Skiltron going out to the flank as well. My ally sort of pulling back. We're content to be a little bit more defensive because it was quite clear early on that we had the skirmish advantage, which wasn't necessarily going to win us the battle, but it would certainly help us early on to counteract the fact that the Normans had brought some pretty plentiful skirmishes themselves.
They flee before our might.
None of the Flemish crossbows or the Kirkin crossbows are on the field. So no real close range punch, no javelins either. So it is going to come down to a pure melee fight. You can see my opponent, well, our opponents, probing the lines with their knights, but the Royal Cavalry from Kirkin pulling back. There's more cavalry on my front, but they are of individually lower quality, and as long as I keep my spears in close contact with my infantry line, it shouldn't be too much of a problem. So our opponents just sort of feeling each other out here, but eventually our opponents are going to have to be the ones to make the first move, simply because we have the skirmish advantage. But in this game, again, as I said, it's not really the be-all and end-all. Infantry is really the king in this game. And the Normans have got pretty plentiful foot soldiers and mailed spearmen that we're going to have to hack our way through. I think he's got 4 units of foot soldiers and 6 units of the, well, yeah, 6 units of these Norman mailed spears. Not the easiest to deal with, but fortunately my Royal Hussars are going to be there to really give a spike of damage. It's my ally over here who's brought less infantry, which may struggle a little bit more against the sheer number of mailed spears and Norman foot soldiers, but he does have a lot of these Alban axe warriors, which hopefully should be able to do some decent damage as the Norman foot soldiers advance. And now the Highland sharpshooters under fire from the Norman archers across the field, but overall they should be able to deal with them. Of course, the only 2 ammunition types available are the standard shot and the flaming arrows. Flaming arrows won't really serve too much of a valid purpose here. The additional damage of the standard shot to infantry is probably going to be the thing which is going to be necessary. And actually, as my opponent was pulling back with his archers, I decided to bring over a couple of my select feared archers to shore up my allies' front line of skirmishers, and this will drastically increase our killing potential over here against these Norman archers. See these select archers over here. It's not often you'll see the English and the Scots fighting alongside one another from this time period for well, from this time period on, about 1,000 years. Nonetheless, the select archers moving into the gap, which these archers actually abandoned when they broke. But also the Norman cavalry and a lot of the Norman infantry, which swung out wide, is prompting my ally to form up not a new box, but certainly the beginnings of some tactical geometry over here with his Skiltron spears and his Albanax warriors. Eventually we're going to have to think about pulling our archers back, and indeed I think my ally is already doing this. We managed to break off another unit of these Norman archers, which is good for us. The skirmish potential of this army over here has been drastically decreased. But we are being, you know, they are encircling us somewhat, and against two Norman armies this was always going to be the case because, you know, we weren't Welsh factions to answer their increased mobility power. You can see that I'm also moving, sort of squeezing over here, making sure to keep the wall close to make sure these cavalry don't really have an easy way in. Also got my archers over here so I can quickly change to flaming shot and frighten those horses off. Skiltron over here, so spears. Very nice out wide on the flank here to prevent the Norman knights from getting too much of a solid connection. But now you can see that the Normans are starting to move forward. So the fairly lengthy skirmish phase is coming to an end now. The Normans are going to come forward with the full force of their infantry and spearmen, which is going to be, you know, challenging to deal with because there's a lot of them and they are of good quality all around. Whereas we've had to make some compromises. I've got some low tier axemen over here, and my ally has got some levy spears as well. The Norman infantry is pretty much all of retinue tier 3 quality, and we've only got a few units that can deal with that. My infantry line is probably better prepared to deal with this than Kirkin's. They're using their fire arrows to fire in, but very limited casualties here being inflicted upon the Norman mailed spears. Good shield values, of course, good armour values, and the flaming shot does less damage against infantry as it is, I think. So particularly when they're in shield castle, these arrows won't really phase these professional Norman soldiers. But still moving forward with the foot soldiery just behind them. Kirkin forming up a right-angled front line. My direct opponent has also moved up. He's also got his front line in shield castle as well to prevent me from skirmishing him as efficiently on the approach. But I was saving my archers for the cavalry because that cavalry could still prove to be a big nuisance for me. Overall, I still felt confident in my chances to win the infantry fight just because my Royal Hussars are going to be able to deal so much damage to the likes of the foot soldiers and these mailed spears. They've only got one unit of axemen to really answer them. My front line is significantly thinner though, so hopefully the additional price I paid for my elite sword infantry is going to pay dividends in the long run. The Norman archers out here on the flank doing some extra damage, but now here comes the initial advance. So the Norman mailed spearmen are coming in, and I believe they should be able to slowly but surely wear down the Alban axe infantry. Here we go. The Normans colliding with the Scots on the front line. But actually seeing a bit of a gap because our opponents did not advance as one, so I decided to aid my ally a little bit. So one of my units of Churl axemen and my Royal Hussars are coming over here to give my ally a hand, and also these Alban swordsmen moving forward. So with the support of my axemen, they're going to go after these Norman foot soldiers, and then I'm going to use these Royal Hussars over here to wrap up the line and start attacking these Normans from the side. And over here we can see that my select spearmen are actually going to be collapsed in on by a lot of these Norman units. So over here my spears will start to fall apart eventually. There's a lot of swordsmen over here which my spears are going to be ill-equipped to deal with. So I did actually bring over a couple of my Royal Thanes to try and help, but again there was another unit of spears on hand to deal with that, and the rest of his infantry line. So his numbers are going to be leveraged against me pretty effectively here. He's focusing his force over here, and he's just occupying my elite sword infantry with what he can over here. And I'm going to push up around here to the flank as well. As a matter of fact, I think it's a good idea. The enemy general is indeed dead, and you can see here how quickly the Norman mailed spearmen fell apart to a rear charge from my Royal Hussars. Not a single casualty on my Hussars. You know, they are brutal off the charge, and they had a perfect charge into the side rear of the Norman mailed spears. Meanwhile, you can see over here, my opponent's still using fire arrows, trying to use shock to take out the Norman advance. But Kirkin is holding very well again. I was very pleased that I actually decided to aid my ally like this, because over here we should be able to wrap up this Norman army relatively quickly. at this stage in proceedings. We are already ahead in terms of man count. Over here we can see the Norman Mailed Spearmen out on the flank. They will be able to beat the Skiltrom eventually, I think. But again, Kirkin are able to leverage their superior numbers. Kirkin's cavalry is also chasing down the Norman archers, and the Norman cavalry was too far away to help out his flagging infantry line at this point. You know, Kirkin, as well as some of the reinforcements from myself, doing a huge amount of damage to the Normans. And again, these Norman foot soldiers, they're losing decisively. They're now being accosted by the King's Blades and the Royal Hussars, although the Royal Hussars do start to take a few losses when the Norman foot soldiers actually engage them and they aren't just being charged in the back. But again, even my Char Laxman, they are losing actually, the Char Laxman apparently. But all they're there for is to give my ally a little bit of extra support. I'm trying to fire into the sides over here, of this front line over here. Let's just see what's going on in slow motion. You can see that my spears are outmatched over here. The focusing of force from the Norman foot soldiers is eventually going to break this line over here. But elsewhere on the lines, my Royal Thanes are going up against just single units of spears, and my Thanes should be able to deal with this sort of thing relatively easily. The Norman Hussars are also getting into the fight over here against another unit of Thanes, and my Royal Bodyguard, where is that? I think my Royal Bodyguard's over here indeed, getting stuck right in, my general, right up into the face of these Norman spears. But here we can have a cavalry engagement as well. So the Norman cavalry colliding with my Earl's Horsemen. They also got a very nice charge here on my Char Laxman, trying to deal with some of the chaff. They really want to get in behind my line, and I knew that, so I switched to fire ammunition, and I'm going to try and draw off these horsemen. But with my spears here, honestly, they're not... with my spears and archers, individually they'd be able to overwhelm my horsemen. But my horsemen individually are actually a better quality. He skimped out on his cavalry and his archers to have a much more comprehensive infantry line, and that is actually going to help me here, because if he had a stronger cavalry force of Norman Knights and Norman Miles, I'd be really scared about this, because he would be able to overwhelm my Earl's Horsemen and then charge my archers and potentially wrap up my infantry line, as we are doing to his ally over on the other side of the battlefield. But you can see over here that his horsemen are already losing decisively thanks to the fire ammunition, thanks to the sheer amount of spears that I've got over here, and the fact that my cavalry is not falling apart too quickly in the face of his basic Norman cavalry. On my other flank, however, things are also not really going to code for me, because the Norman foot soldiers are pretty rapidly hacking their way through my select militia spearman, and this will of course allow him to wrap up my line on the other side, as I'm going to do to him. So relatively even fight over here between myself and the Norman army on this side, but the additional reinforcements that I've sent over to help Kirkin are rapidly going to help us gain the upper hand over here. The Sword Warriors winning slightly alongside my Char Laxman, who are actually losing decisively, but again against these basic Norman foot soldiers, but I didn't really expect them to win. But still, the sheer amount of damage that my Royal Hussars are doing by charging into the rear of the Norman line, and this is where his cavalry being too far away to support his infantry line is really coming back to hurt him, because over on the other side as well with the Kirkin spears, his cavalry would have been much better served being over here. They could have got a nice charge into the back of these Royal Hussars, but slowly but surely the Norman foot soldiers and the Norman mailed spearmen are just not going to stand too much of a chance against the Hussars and against the resolute Kirkin front line. I mean, the Skiltrom are starting to lose decisively on this front line, but they don't need to win. All they need to do is hold, because the King's Blades and the Royal Hussars are leading the charge as we just wrapped around the Norman front line and destroyed it. There's also these Highland sharpshooters over here, but having said that, trying to use my general's ability to keep my front line in check, but ultimately we now have a horde of Norman cavalry, which is about to get a nice charge onto one of my isolated units of archers, which I sent around to try and shoot into the back of the front line to keep mine from collapsing as long as I could. But naturally, under a cavalry charge like that, they are going to, if not completely be wiped out, certainly shattered from the field. With that though, this is still a very strong point of Norman infantry, however, and the balance of power is only just in our favour. It wouldn't take too much. I mean, honestly, if my front line were to break, that would be very bad for us. I've still got a lot of these archers chasing down the cavalry over there. We also have some select militia spears. I think, actually, we have a unit of these Norman Hussars over here, so this is the general unit on this side. And I'm just going to try and occupy them with a unit of spears. I want to keep them off the front line as much as I can. If they're on the front line, they could do a lot of damage. My own Royal Hussars are on the front line as well, and you can see that the Normans are starting to lose heart of the fight. Wherever the Royal Hussars are, they're doing a lot of damage. I've got a unit of spears over here which I'm trying to use, but here you can see the Normans have been relatively successful. They have broken and kind of split our army with their cavalry a little bit, so Kirkin and you know, the dregs of what I had over here are kind of separate from one another, but it doesn't really matter because I think the quality of our infantry is simply going to be too much. Got my archers over here, which I'm going to use to try and shoot into the backs of these units. His archers are still at the back, which would have been a problem for my archers, but of course I still have a unit of 3 Earl's Horsemen, which I'm just going to use to finish up the Norman archers.
Our allies' general has fallen.
Unfortunately for us, the Kirkin general has fallen, which has led to a bit of a break over here, but really the only strong point of the Norman army at this point are a bunch of these cavalry units. I'm trying to slow them down with 1 unit of Earl's Horsemen, but they are being rapidly outmatched. The fire arrows are coming in the back of these Norman foot soldiers. Select militia spears. A lot of my units are routing. You can see that the Normans are starting to wrap up the line just like we did to his ally on the other front. And this is a bit of a problem for me, but they have encountered my Royal Thanes. And the Royal Thanes will not go quietly like my militia spears did. And I'm going to try and reinforce them with my breaking units again. Char Laxman aren't really going to do much to help them out, but they are at least going to slow down the progress of this Norman flanking manoeuvre. And ultimately over here as well, his units are going to be outmatched. Although his Norman Hussars are coming in here, so his front line's doing relatively well against mine so far, but how we were able to isolate his ally and how myself and Kirkin worked in tandem is ultimately going to be the end of the Normans here. You can see over here that the Norman foot soldiers are now being overwhelmed by the Kirkin forces, which were victorious on the other flank. The King's Blades coming in to help out against the Norman foot soldiers. And we have now also my cavalry returned from chasing down the Norman archers. And ultimately the Norman cavalry, the Norman horsemen, are running out of steam as well. My allies' cavalry is coming in here as well. That's going to be just about it. Oh, and we do have a charge coming in from my Royal Hussars. They've already got a ton of kills from taking on the Norman army on the other side. And now they're going to get a rear charge onto these Norman foot soldiers over here to save and shore up this front line. And ultimately the Normans are not going to be able to last too much longer. We've surrounded them over here, and we are going to be able to surround them over here as well, albeit with archers, but for the most part we've managed to get a surround off on them. My Royal Bodyguard still fighting strong, only lost 18 unit models. The Saxon Royal Bodyguard is very difficult to take down. And now our cavalry running rampant. The Norman foot soldiers, so yeah, this is only a matter of time. Some of my units have returned. And then we have what is bound to be a bit of a chain rout. You can see that they are shaken. A lot of the Norman units are shaken. And with this rear charge, I think that's going to be it. And indeed it was. That was going to be a chain rout. Or it might have been him admitting defeat, but regardless, a chain rout would have been right around the corner anyway. So, the Saxon-Gaelic alliance, the alliance of England and Scotland, manages to throw off the continental invader at Hadrian's Wall. And I got the most amount of kills, but again, I think that comes down to the fact that these Royal Hussars over here, which were responsible for assisting my ally in wrapping up the line of the Norman forces on the other side of Hasinger, you know, they got an enormous amount of kills, and they are certainly responsible for how well I did in terms of my kills. My Hussars in general was something which the Normans were always going to struggle a little bit to answer, because neither the mailed spearmen nor the Norman foot soldiers are really equipped to deal with them one-to-one, and if they get their charge off, that's going to be a huge amount of damage they do. My Royal Thanes also did pretty well across the board, one of them breaking 100 kills. This one was the one that was holding on for dear life on the side where my front line was breaking. They did very well for themselves, and my horsemen as well, the ones that, you know, mostly this was archers, admittedly, when I was chasing them down in the late game. My other one, though, didn't do too badly either. They managed to trade relatively well with the Norman cavalry over here, 148 kills. The Norman cav was certainly a very strong point of their army. 291 kills on the Norman Hussars as well, so they were going after my select militia spears, which really struggled against the Norman front line. You know, they did... I was intending them to just be sort of something to ward off cavalry, and obviously when they got into combat with the much more professional, much more high quality Norman spears and foot soldiers, they started to fall apart, and the Hussars, of course, were a big part of that. Having a look at my allies' army, his cavalry did very well. His cavalry, you know, were of relatively decent quality as well. Over here, his King's Blades were the best that any of his infantry units did. His infantry was relatively lackluster across the board. They managed to trade evenly with the Normans, which is, you know, a pretty big compliment considering the Normans have got some very nice infantry units. But having said that, his cavalry was where he clearly spent the vast bulk of his money other than his King's Blades, and his cavalry performed as he would have expected, I imagine. On my side, of course, the Hussars, the cavalry did very well. Hasinger, he had the unfortunate, you know, reality of having to deal with his line being crumpled from the side And then obviously with my Royal Hussars leading the way and the shielded Kirkin infantry following in behind them, his infantry was always going to struggle mightily, and really that was where we won this battle, because on the other front, the direct confrontation between myself and Black Widow's Norman army was relatively even for the most part across the battlefield, but obviously as soon as the Kirkin forces arrived on the scene in the late game, particularly that cavalry, the Normans didn't really stand a chance. So, I hope you enjoyed this Thrones of Britannia 2 versus 2 at Hadrian's Wall. I hope to do a few more interesting fights on Thrones of Britannia. I know most people, are here purely for Third Age Reforged, but for my own sanity, I want to get some variety in there, and ultimately, if I'm going to do this channel for the long run, I do need to, inject some sort of, there needs to be some sort of evolution. I can't simply do the same thing over and over again. So try not to judge it too harshly, because I do enjoy playing Thrones of Britannia. It's a fun game. I mean, admittedly, it probably will burn out a little bit more quickly than Third Age Reforged, but by that time, Three Kingdoms will be right around the corner and we can start all over again. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you will join me for whatever is next.